Okay, so I'm Massimo Pigliucci. I started out my career as an evolutionary biologist. I was interested in, first in Italy and then in the United States. I was interested in gene-environment interactions, nature-nurture kind of things. That's what I did my experimental, empirical work. I've also become over time more and more interested in sort of the general structure of evolutionary theories, the logic underlying it, the relationship between logic and evidence and that sort of stuff. And so without realizing it, I started doing philosophy of science. Then my midlife crisis hit, and I did two things. Instead of buying a red car, getting a whatever it is, I moved to New York, which greatly improved the quality of my life. And I moved full-time to philosophy. I went back to graduate school, got my PhD in philosophy, and thanks to Dan's letter of recommendation, I got a position at CUNY as a full-time philosopher. One of the things that struck me when I met Dan the first time was this quote that I think is from Darwin's Dangerous Idea about not there being any such thing as science without philosophy. It's just science that has the baggage, philosophical baggage, unexamined. So I thought, I am a professional scientist with 20 years in my career, more than 100 publications, a few books and all that. I take the time to go back to graduate school and become a philosopher. So surely the scientists will take me seriously because I'm one of them. The philosophers will take me seriously because I actually did the damn hard work of reading every one of Plato's dialogues and that sort of stuff. And of course, the reality is usually, not always, but usually the other way around. Now, for the scientists, I went to the dark side. For the philosophers, I'm much too much of a scientist. I'm interested in actual empirical questions, and Dan put it earlier, that's really weird. It's being interested in China's economy while talking about philosophy of mind. But it has been a great ride so far, and my general approach to that is that science and philosophy are different ways of thinking and different ways of doing things, and in part they do deal with different kinds of questions, but that they both belong to what it used to be called scientia, a larger version of, a larger concept of knowledge, and I think that the best thing we can do about it is just to sort of intellectually respect both enterprises, despite the number of scientists or philosophers who do spend their time doing things that are not particularly relevant, and we should correct them when they do. In terms of current projects, I have a new book coming out for the University of Chicago Press next year on the philosophy of pseudoscience, or what is normally called the demarcation problem. It goes back to Popper. It was thought dead by Larry Loudon in the 80s, and then now I and a few other people got together thinking that actually there's probably something else that can be said about it, or should be said about it.
Maybe you should say what the demarcation problem is.
Yes, sorry, what is the difference between science and pseudoscience, or science and non-science in general, which goes to all sorts of interesting issues about, can you actually come up with reasonably sensible definitions of concepts such as science and pseudoscience. What is it good for? What are you doing that sort of thing, and so on and so forth. Rebecca brought up earlier the question of progress in philosophy. One of the things that I'm doing right at the moment, in fact, is to write a book about progress in philosophy, because I find that philosophers are very highly self-flagellating individuals. They are hypercritical about their own discipline, and sometimes for good reasons, but that is not one of them, I think.
So that's what separates philosophy from physics.
Yeah. And so I've been thinking about it, and I think I have a reasonable argument that philosophy does make progress, and I have the ways to show it, but of course it's a different sense from the way science makes progress, which I think is perfectly reasonable. As you know, several of you know, I sparred occasionally via blogs with several of you, but I assure you it was always in a positive and constructive way. At least that was the intention. Sometimes it might not have come up that way. Because I believe people have mentioned David Hume several times. I think I'm the only one actually has a tattoo with one of his quotes, and the quote is, "Truth springs from argument amongst friends." And I hope that is going to be the sort of the general idea of this workshop as well. As far as changing my mind, well, I just did recently. It's Dan's fault. Him, James Lediman, wrote this book that he mentioned earlier, and I happened to read it with a group of graduate students this year, and it really did change my mind, open a new vistas about all sorts of things. So I now find myself changing my mind about certain aspects of naturalism, philosophy of mathematics, certain implications, metaphysical implication of physics. I could change my mind back, but frankly, had it just done it, I'd rather stick with it for another year or two, but I'm open to that. The last thing I wanted to do was to ask if, I'm honored to be part of this group, so I like occasionally to take pictures. I hope that that's okay with the rest of you.
If you send them to us.
Yes, of course.
Happy to post things on the webpage if anyone has pictures or anything else.
I wish I had a tattoo.
That can be, maybe that can be arranged. And I do have a convertible. So,
There you go.
I'm David Poeppel, or Poeppel, if you speak German, David Poeppel. I'm from Munich. I'll keep the Bavarian within.
Are you Purple Sun?
I am.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm, and I fit the profile by being a relentless field changer. Apparently everyone here was doing something that they didn't want to do. As an undergraduate, I studied cell biology and linguistics. And then I worked as an actor for a while. So that's something completely different. And then I needed to get a job. So I went to graduate school. So it shows my naivete. And I studied neuroscience, and I went back to linguistics. And so now I run a lab. So I'm actually a laboratory person, where the rubber meets the road. At NYU, I study human brain science. And there's two kind of things that I've been obsessing about for a while. One that I think is probably not so much for discussion here is the broadly construed the temporal structure of perceptual experience. As it turns out, you think we're just kind of flowing through the world here on smoothly surfing on an arrow of time. The granularity of experience is very peculiar, and you can do all kinds of nifty tricks. And other than just being cool, I think it has some interesting implications for what the sort of primitive the parts list is for perception, representation, and so on. So if you want to see some cool effects, I can show you some all kinds of nice experiments. What I worry about that's a bit more related to the topics here is what I call when in discussions we had. So I work on language in the brain, and I work on, or think about and obsess about, let's say, the parts list or the granularity problem. As I am impressed, actually, by what cognitive psychology and linguistics and philosophy and computer science have achieved in the last 50 years. I think it's to be taken seriously, and as a neuroscientist, I'm actually unimpressed by what we've achieved in neuroscience. So I think neuroscience has failed for the moment, as a member of the Society for Neuroscience. I can say that. So where we're sort of incrementally succeeding is in what we might call the maps problem. Is we make increasingly better maps because we have cool machines. As experimentalists, we build, whether it's fMRI scanners or 2-photon microscopy or optogen. I mean, our tools are getting better and better. That's great. So we make finer maps in that. But so the resolution, the spatial resolution, the temporal resolution of how we do work is really very impressive. Regrettably, the conceptual resolution has not been so impressive. So
the conceptual equipment is so expensive.
The conceptual equipment. So I think that neuroscience actually hasn't kept pace with let's say, the cognitive sciences, including everything that goes under there. And so very concretely, the way I view the work in my own lab, the sort of is to figure out what the parts list is I view us as basically a bunch of people in a garage, like you're taking the thing apart like a bunch of mechanics, right? We want to know the primitives, the ontological structure of the thing. And it turns out that the mapping problem is finding some alignments between what we think is going on in psychology, cognitive science, and neuroscience is essentially non-existent. So we have maybe this is a version of the manifest image problem, reduced to a particular, the relationship between psychology and neurobiology. So it's this kind of common sense conception in one sense and formal conception of the sciences. But I think I'm modestly enthusiastic that we can make progress, but I don't see how unless we make really radical shifts in our conceptual understanding of how language and cognition more broadly is construed, studied, and so on. And as an experimentalist, I have to translate what we talk about casually into things that I can actually measure, explain, characterize, formalize, and that's a slightly different kind of problem. No, that hasn't come up yet this morning. So, and it's great to be here, a lot of fun. Thanks.
I'm Jennifer Willett. I'm a science writer. My job here is primarily to listen and learn and ask the occasional pointed questions. But in many respects, I feel at home here because I'm very much like a lot of the people at this table. Most of us, it seems like, have a very interdisciplinary background just because we didn't know what we wanted to be when we grew up. Very much appreciated what Rebecca was talking about libraries being dangerous places, because like her, I grew up in a very religious family, in this case an evangelical religious family. And ironically, because my dad had been the first member of his family to go to college, and he got a good job as a result, he thought his kids should learn. So they did value education. They hadn't quite thought that through. They didn't really understand what education was. It wasn't just a job training, and so they didn't seem to think there was anything wrong with me reading all these books. But of course I got exposed to ideas that they never in a million years would have told me. My tastes were not as highbrow as Rebecca's. I did not stumble on the story of the atom. The big story that changed my life when I was like 8 or 9 years old was a horror story that I found in this Alfred Hitchcock anthology called Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper. What was shocking about it was that it was written in the first person, and this guy is trying to help a detective find Jack the Ripper, and at the very last paragraph you find out that the narrator is Jack the Ripper. It was my first encounter with the unreliable narrator, and so of course as someone who loved reading and writing, I liked that about my craft. But it's more important because from a child's perspective, up to that point, you just believe what people tell you. And when you're being told, about God and the Bible and all these sorts of things, it does not occur to you that someone might not be a reliable narrator. So for me, I was already beginning to have doubts because, I couldn't speak in tongues no matter how hard I tried, and it just did not make any sense to me, that this world that I found myself raised in, to realize that perhaps I was being told the wrong story, that perhaps I was being told something that wasn't true. And it took many, many years after that to get me to a level of naturalism, but eventually I did get there, and I credit voracious reading in public libraries with being a very key part of that. I was an English major. I ended up becoming a science writer specializing in physics. Sean and I like to joke that he covers the very big and the very small, and I like all the messy stuff in between. I like materials and phase transitions and thermodynamics and all those sorts of things. And I'm very interested in the questions of complexity and consciousness, among other things. So it's interesting. I am not, while I am an atheist, I am not particularly involved in being a public atheist. For me, many of the discussions that surround science and religion that take place in the broad public sphere are not very interesting to me. It ends up rehashing the same old arguments, nobody changes their minds, that sort of thing. This sort of conference interests me a great deal because I'm looking at a bunch of people who thought very deeply about very important issues, all of whom apparently are at least willing to consider changing their minds, and that alone makes it a wonderful experience for me. It's a privilege as a science writer to be able to interact and listen in on some of these conversations. For my own part, you could probably change my mind about anything because any opinions I have on this stuff are very, very preliminary and new. But I am very much interested. One thing you might not be able to convince me of, or would be very difficult to convince me of, is this notion of the self and consciousness as an emergent phenomenon. I see a lot of stuff being bandied about these days, with books and articles and things about this means that the self is an illusion. I simply don't accept that. I come from a physics perspective. Emergence is real. A traffic jam is emergent, but it is nonetheless real. So I'd be very interested, if someone wants to argue for the illusion thing, I'd be interested in hearing about it.
Okay. let me just respond to what Jennifer said. I would define illusion as something that is not what it seems to be, not something that's completely non-existent. So in that sense, I do think consciousness is an illusion as well as free will. But more about that later.
We'll get there, yeah.
Okay. I'll dispense with my biography. It's kind of boring. I'm an evolutionary biologist who came to this late, trying to teach evolutionary biology. And I suspect, like Richard, my becoming an atheist and a naturalist was a reaction to the fact that the opposition to what I was trying to teach, which was obdurate, was based on religious faith that you could not dispel by teaching people the facts about evolution. From that, it became transformed to theology. I mean, I realized the way to teach evolution was to get rid of religion. And then how do you do that? Well, you can reform society, but you can also argue against religion. The new atheists have done that very well. I'm writing a book now, and that's one reason I'm interested in this conference, about the incompatibility between science and religion. So there's a lot of areas in there that I want to get people's takes on at this meeting. That involves questions of free will, questions of mathematics, questions about how we know things. Are there other ways of knowing things besides science? I'm here, I guess, specifically to address the question of free will. I guess I'm one of the few incompatibilists in this group. I guess Alex is another one. To me, the question seems largely semantic. And since Sean brought this up in his introduction, I'll just respond to that. He had a theory that, that free will is compatible with determinism because humans behave rationally. My alternative theory is that we're collations of molecules that obey the laws of physics, and sometimes it appears that we do that rationally, but a lot of times we don't. And my replacement for free will would be the statement, our decisions are made by internal forces that we don't understand, and that we should deep six the idea of free will in terms of this statement. In terms of what I've been willing to change my mind about, this is a question I've been wrestling with for my book, and it's a powerful weapon in the armamentarium of theologians. There are other ways of knowing besides science. In other words, art, literature, music are ways of knowing. I'm interested in exploring that question. Of course, that's all used to justify religious ways of knowing, and I don't believe in that. I don't believe religion is a way of knowing, but I'm interested in knowing whether there are other ways of knowing besides science.
Is a way of knowing a way of acquiring justified true beliefs?
So about what?
Is a way of knowing a way of acquiring justified true beliefs?
That's one definition of it, but in that sense you could make a case that there are ways of knowing beyond science, like when your kid tells you, I'm hungry, okay? That's a justified true belief, but it's not attained through science. I mean, you can test it through science, but, anyway, these are the kinds of questions. I'm completely open about this. I haven't decided. I would like to think that science answers all questions. In that sense, I would be a scientist, or we call somebody who is an advocate of scientism. None of that is to justify religion, but theologians use art, music, and literature as ways of knowing, and from that, then Jesus and Revelation is a way of knowing too. So I'd like to be able to discuss that question. I'm honored to be in this group, which is a massive collation of impressive neurons. I'd like to ask, both for the benefit of myself and for the people who are going to be watching this YouTube video, as we try to stay away from specific jargon that's particular to our fields, because a lot of stuff that's going around I don't understand very well. Terms like homuncular functionalist boggle my mind, so I might interrupt people and ask them to explain.
Actually, let me just emphasize that I very much agree with that. In fact, I forgot to say at the very intro to at least bring up an idea that Dan had that I didn't think would quite work out, but it's a brilliant idea, which is that what we should have done is import 4 undergraduates to sit in the room and then demand that everyone talk as if they're talking to the undergraduates.
I can do
Well, Jennifer and I volunteer for that.
There's a community college around the corner.
But that means that you have to be proactive in
Yes.
raising your hand and saying, what does that mean?
I will. I actually think I understand the homuncular function. I actually
Makes
do.
sense.
Yes. So, but yes,
So
I will not hide my ignorance anymore.
Yeah, well, I will be asking questions too, at the risk of looking ignorant and stupid. I'd rather learn than remain in the dark. The last thing I want to say, which is related to what Massimo says, I have a copy of my popular book that I'd like to pass around during the meetings for you to autograph. That's not for my benefit. I'd like to sell it
That didn't come out right.
I want to auction it off to the readers of my website and donate the proceeds to Doctors Without Borders. I think I could get at least $1,000 for it. So if you would be so kind as to just write your name, maybe a statement about naturalism or something in the book during this week, I would be much gratified. So, Stephen.
Would you mind if I plagiarized that idea?
If what? Yeah.
Should have all brought our books, but okay.
I'm Stephen Weinberg. I guess in this group I'm the dull guy because I'm a theoretical physicist. Now, I always wanted to be a theoretical physicist, at least since high school. And I don't understand why other people aren't theoretical physicists.
Because they're not smart enough.
Well,
So you're glad not everyone is.
I'm not defrocked, unlike some others here. About my work, I work in the theory of elementary particles and quantum field theory, which is essentially the same thing. And I have a sideline working in cosmology. And I'm also extremely interested in the history of physics and trying to write something about the history from Thales to Newton. About the topics to be discussed here, I have a wide open mind about some of them. Reality and naturalism, I really don't know a useful definition of what they mean. I'm all for them, but I'm not sure what they are. With regard to consciousness and mathematics, I think I know what they are, but I don't see how they fit into natural science. And that's also a subject that I'm really open to enlightenment about. On the other hand, on some other topics on the list, emergence, morality, and free will, I have strong views which I think are unlikely to change, and I'm probably going to snarl at people who disagree with me. And let's see how it goes.
All right, so speaking of which, so my idea was that I would appoint people sort of, so that I wasn't doing the talking all the time, where you can be organizing, guide us through each session, and you know who you are, and but I'll take the first session, which is just starting now, and is only going to go for a little while, but it merges into the second session, so this afternoon, Terry is going to take the reins, and Simon will provoke us with some thoughts about emergence. Is that a fair way of saying it? But we're going to start off today with Alex provoking us with some thoughts about, I'm not sure how you want to cast what your thoughts are, but we'll find out.
My remarks are very brief. There are too many betters of me in this room who have thought about these matters. So, in addition to being brief, I hope they will be provocative. They are intended to be. I may also say that I brought one copy of my book, which I will give to whoever convinces me that I can reconcile the manifest image with the scientific image. Oh, right. So, as I say somewhere in a part of my book, widely ridiculed, there's nothing but fermions and bosons. That's what reality is composed of. And that, I think, is why Sean asked me to start today. But I don't think that we should trouble ourselves discussing the details of particle physics, especially in the presence of Stephen Weinberg. I certainly don't hold that physics has bottomed out, and perhaps it won't ever bottom out in, say, superstring theory or some equally fundamental way of reconciling quantum field theory and general relativity. But naturalism and our view of the nature of reality doesn't require us to take sides on matters at the frontiers of physics. All it requires, I think, is two features of physics which are fixed and unlikely, and I mean that with very grave confidence, to be changed in the subsequent development of physics, no matter where it goes. And that have been fixed in physics for a very long time. And those two features of physical theory are its resolute denial of teleology of any kind.
You're going to tell us what teleology is, right?
Actually, I thought that was a word that would be common coin around the table, but I simply mean it denies, physics has no role for, and in fact has shown that there is not in the universe any kind of either backward causation from the future pulling events in some trajectory, or any imminent causation that involves some kind of a representation of what the future is like, and which organizes things in order to attain that, whether it's God or something inside of nature, imminent or eminent. So the denial of purpose, goal, end seems to me a feature that physics has maintained ever since Newton, and is unlikely ever to be removed from physics, that no successor theory to the succession of theories that have been advanced since Newton is likely to include any scope for such causal processes. And the second is the second law of thermodynamics.
And so let me just parenthetically say, so an interesting thing we don't need to discuss right now, but to put on the table is, if we buy that particle physics and fundamental physics has no teleology in it, is it nevertheless useful to talk about emergent phenomena in the world as if they are teleological? You know, the length of the neck of the giraffe, does it serve a purpose?
Right, so I might say we can certainly help ourselves to purposive teleological functional vocabulary, but in doing so we understand that we are engaging in a somewhat misleading set of metaphors, in the way, of course, that evolutionary biologists do when they talk about design problems, without any commitment whatsoever to designers or to any process in nature that could properly be called designing. So in that sense, we're allowed to help ourselves to it, but if we took that matter, if we took that lingo seriously, there'd be no difference between Newtonian mechanics and Aristotelian mechanics, and there's a big difference. And the second thing that I think physics has made a fixed point for all of the other disciplines is the second law of thermodynamics, and everything that happens in the universe had better be not just compatible with the second law of thermodynamics, but be driven by the second law, because that is the source of all the asymmetry in the cosmos. Yes, all the time asymmetry, right. And I think there's no other asymmetries besides the time asymmetries, or what is produced by the time asymmetries. So this brings me to the matter that will, of course, be touched upon this afternoon and probably regularly through the rest of the weekend, and in which I will be in the snarling chorus with Stephen Weinberg, and that is reductionism. Okay? Reductionism, and here I'm going to use some jargon, is a metaphysical thesis. It says basically that there's no downward causation, and that the physical is causally closed. That is, that everything that happens is a matter of causes and effects to be understood at their fundamental level in physics. That insofar as there appears to be anything like downward causation or emergentism, those appearances reflect temporary ignorance. And that the explanatory autonomy of higher levels of disciplines that explain phenomena at higher levels of organization than physics is an epistemic thesis. The explanatory autonomy of these disciplines is an epistemic thesis and not a metaphysical thesis, and it reflects human cognitive limitations and human cognitive interests, and no fundamental facts about the organization of reality. And I want to stop there because I put enough hostages to fortune on the table that we could easily spend the rest of the weekend on this agenda.
So I have plenty of things to say, but I'm going to let other people chime in. Don't wait for me.
And it's Sean's fault that I was asked. I told him, look, Weinberg or Carroll are the right people to talk about the nature of reality, but he said, no, Weinberg's going to talk about ethics.
So, seems to me, because you put so many hostages on the table, we should try to pick the hostage that's most valuable here. Right here.
You wanted to pay the most ransom?
Yeah, that's right. You're committed I mean, you're committed to the view, and without this, everything falls apart for your view, I think. You're committed to the view that, as you put it in your book, and as lots of philosophers have put it in the past, physics fixes all the facts, right? But now, that statement is quite hard to actually unpack. I mean, so you don't mean that fundamental physical theory fixes all the facts, because fundamental physical theory doesn't talk about most of the facts. I mean, that's why we have special sciences.
So what is the definition of a fact in this case?
Oh no, did you have to ask that?
I did, yes.
True sentence.
Yeah, true sentences, okay. So
The way things are arranged in,
And the most interesting facts are relatively general facts, right? So, I mean, the descriptions of the space-time coordinates of something are facts, but there's infinity of such facts, but from where special sciences are concerned, we're particularly interested in generalizations, not necessarily universal generalizations, but generalizations. Now, so physical theory doesn't fix all those facts because it doesn't talk about most of those things. So the other thing you could mean, and I'm sure you do mean, is that if there's some description that somebody could, in principle, have entirely in the language of physical theory, from which some extraordinary information processing system could derive all the other facts. It's very hard for me to see what could constitute evidence for that claim, right? That looks like a statement of metaphysical faith. And I think we should be just a little bit verificationist, right? That statement of metaphysical faith seems to me to wildly outrun what any particular scientist calls.
What's the statement of metaphysical faith?
That, in principle, right, some extraordinary information processing system could describe describe things at the fundamental physical level, such that that same extraordinary information processing system, or some even more extraordinary information processing system, could then derive all of the generalizations of the other special sciences.
Point of order, we seem to be getting into the question of emergence prematurely. I thought this morning we were going to talk about ontology, what is meant by real. Emergence is a part of that, but it's only a part of that. I'd like to make a comment about the more general thing about this question of, what was the phrase that was used for the naive view of reality?
manifest image.
Yeah, whether that is something that makes sense and is permissible to us. It seems to me it obviously is in our everyday life. I mean, we all agree Mitt Romney and Barack Obama are real and that Santa Claus is not real. We use it as a useful phrase, and it would be hard to live without this meaning of reality. And it isn't because we deny that maybe it's because we deny that Santa Claus is composed of elementary particles, but that's not the way we really think about it. We just recognize it as a myth. I think the question is, why should we not use this kind of principled philistinism, refusing to think deeply, but just using real the way we use other terms in our everyday life? Why we shouldn't do that in physics or science also? I mean, is there really a philosophical discontinuity between everyday life, the kind of reasoning we do in everyday life, and science, which makes this naive view of reality impermissible in one, whereas it's useful in the other?
Free will is a classic example of where we have a feeling of agency on the manifest level, but in reality we don't. I mean, if you're incompatible.
Well, you're again going beyond the. I mean, we can argue about that. I think we do I think free will is real, but that's for another session. But everyone in this room has used the word real in an unreflecting, unphilosophical, unsophisticated way. And I don't see any reason for barring its use in the sciences also. I mean, I had a professor at Cornell when I took a philosophy course, Max Black, who said that whenever he is asked the question whether something is real, he always gives the same answer. The answer is yes. But real in different ways, and that is something one can go into. I think temperature is real. I think protons are real. They're real in slightly different ways. I think the Constitution of the United States is real, and I think this newspaper is real, and they're also real in different ways. And it's interesting to explore that, but we shouldn't limit the use of the word real to things which are real in only one narrow sense.
It's worth remembering in this regard, I think I agree with you exactly about that, but there is a tradition that hasn't been mentioned here, maybe for good reason, and not just among philosophers and scientists, who, as it were, said the manifest image has hegemony, is in charge, and it's all the posits of physics that aren't real. They're just instrumentalist fantasies of one sort or another. I think my favorite line about that was David Moser, who made the quip that quantum particles are the dreams stuff is made of.
I think that would be the view of William of Ockham if he was resurrected.
Well, sure, but much more recently we've had serious thinkers who have wanted to say it's tables and chairs that are real. Electrons, those aren't real. Now, if we've abandoned that, if we don't like that view at all, if we're really, I think everybody in this room is pretty much committed to the ontology of the physical sciences. But as Stephen was just saying, don't go overboard in the other direction and say, and that shows that there really aren't any colors, there really aren't any tables and chairs, there aren't any people, there's no consciousness, and because look, we can go around, we can count the glasses on the table.
Of course, that's not a thesis I was defending, nor do I think that we need to even take pains to prevent our being misunderstood as defending that thesis. The thesis I was
fermions,
well, fermions and bosons and everything that's made up of fermions and bosons, right? And in response to Don's question, how can I make concrete the thesis that the physical facts fix all the facts, which is a good way of putting this claim. It's really quite simple, and I wish I had myself thought of this way of putting it. Take the Earth and everything in its immediate vicinity, including the moon and maybe even the sun. There are a lot of physical facts that obtain, and there are also chemical facts and biological facts and neuropsychological facts and economic facts and sociological facts and other such facts. Now take another chunk of the universe and don't think so much of a Boltzmann brain, but think about another chunk of the universe in which the fermions and bosons are arranged in that chunk so that all the relations between them are the same as the relations between the fermions and bosons on this chunk, and you'll get all the same chemical, biological, neuropsychological, sociological, economic, and political facts. What you won't get, of course, is the true historical facts because of obvious considerations that go in philosophy under the name swamp man. But that's all I mean by there's nothing but fermions and bosons and the things composed of them. And I don't even think that's controversial, and it's certainly not something that could be undermined by this wonderful principled Philistinism.
I suppose, am I correct if I said the Constitution of the United States was real? Not a piece of paper on which it's printed, but
as an expression of the relationships among.
I suppose you would say it's real in the sense that it exists in minds, and the minds are in brains, and the brains.
Your first approximation, sure.
Yeah, I see.
So Schrodinger's equation is real in the sense that people can write it down and they're great.
Now there's the problem that Rebecca and Dawn and a couple of people in the coffee break admitted to being perplexed by, and that is certainly the biggest problem for me philosophically, and that's what is the metaphysics and epistemology of mathematical truths.
Can I ask, to what extent is this not a Cartesian view in which you've just given up half the world? And just simply say it's this split is there, there's the teleological stuff and it's all just illusion. Descartes was wrong, it's just simply not there. But it sounds to me like a sort of, half of a Cartesian view. In what sense is it not?
Sticks and stones will break my bones. I didn't quite understand the question, but let me see if I can respond to something that's behind it. We can, of course, continue to employ teleological language, and it's indispensable in the manifest image and also in biology, even though no one takes it seriously. And some people want to go on, and I know that Dan is one of them, to say, and not only that, but Darwin naturalized it and showed how purpose is a garden variety causal process that involves blind variation and natural selection operating at many different levels and in using many different mechanisms to produce adaptation. Okay? Now, glass half empty or half full? I think the glass is half empty. I think that what Darwin showed was that there ain't any teleology, purpose, goals, ends, designs at all in nature, and it's all an overlay. A convenient overlay is something that allows the mind to spread itself out in reality, as Le Bon David once said, but has no more grip on reality than that. And of course, there are those who say, no, because of its overpowering utility and its indispensability in our cognitive economy, it's got to really be out there in the world, and Darwin showed what it really is. Now, is this a verbal dispute or is this a real substantive dispute? I think it's a real substantive dispute.
So I agree with you because of the history of science, that it's been terribly important in the history of science to get rid of the teleology, yes. Get rid of it in Aristotle's physics and the biology that preceded Darwin. Galen thought the Earth, well, he thought the sun was placed where it is so that the Earth would be comfortable. We really it was really important to learn that that's all wrong.
Mm-hmm. Things fall to their natural place.
There's an alternative that I think is missing from your nice division, and for want of a better word, I'm going to call it political. I think that as explainers of science to the general world, we have a political obligation to think very carefully about how we will be misunderstood if we're misunderstood. And I think that in this area, the risks of misunderstanding are huge. You've just given a very clear articulation of the view that there's no real design because no process in nature is a proper designer. This is a view that Richard also shares, and he even came up with a term, designoid, meaning apparently designed. I'm going to tell you why I oppose that, why I think this is a mistake. I'm going to tell mainly an anecdote. There I was in a bar, and I heard these guys talking about the marvels of a cell, inside a cell. They'd just seen a video or heard a lecture or something about the intricacies of what goes on inside a single cell. And one of them looked at the other and said, boy, you see all of those amazing machines and you just realize, how can evolution possibly be true? And my jaw dropped, because these were not rednecks, these were Harvard medical students. And what I realized then, and I have other examples of this, is that the idea is out there in the world that evolutionary biologists, that it is very much in their interest to downplay the marvelousness of nature. And to say, no, there's no design in nature, not really. And so any example of brilliant design in nature is an embarrassment to science. I think that's exactly wrong. I think that we should recognize that what evolution accomplishes and development is stupendously clever. Now, that means that the process, the non-supernatural, natural process, is properly called a design process. Because we can actually compare real design, which is what we see in the biosphere, with pseudo-design. My favorite example of pseudo-design is when a cartoonist like Sidney Harris has a cartoon of science, and he's got a blackboard, and it's all covered with fantastic formulae. And we're all supposed to understand that that's some deep kind of physics or something, and it's just gibberish. That's designoid. It's apparent design. The design in nature is not only real design, it is typically better than what any human engineers can come up with. Yeah. The optimization of energy use and so forth is typically far exceeds what the paradigmatic designers can come up with. So I think we ought to...
I thought the design of the genetic code was pretty bad. Biologists here know more about it than I do, but I thought that if you want to code 3 base pairs to make 1 out of 20 proteins, you can do a lot better than the actual genetic code.
You don't need 64. Well, that's a very interesting question, and there's a great deal of work in evolutionary molecular biology that addresses it, and the more you study that work, the more you realize how good the design is given the constraints. Really? I don't want to get into that. But I am willing, because I've spent a lot of time. My main interest is the philosophy of molecular biology. I can talk about that, and Richard will be in a position to correct everything I said about it. But I want to answer or respond to 2 of Dan's points, because I think both of them are extremely serious. First, on the political. Nothing has scared me more about writing my book than its potential political consequences. And political in the broad sense that you mentioned. And it has given me pause, because I do believe that, as the wife of the Bishop of Winchester said, leaving the British Academy, descended from monkeys, let us hope it is not true, but if it is true, let us hope it is not widely known.
And the correction, Worcester.
Worcester, did I say, excuse me, Worcester. So, because of course, if my view is right and it becomes widely known, then it is a stick with which to beat naturalists. And of course, I do get an occasional email from an evangelical theology professor telling me that he's making my book required reading for all of the students for this reason. And my only consolation is that since my book isn't a narrative, and since it rails against narrative, it's rather difficult to read, and so not likely to have this nefarious effect. Although the YouTube of what we do here may, and I am frankly very concerned about that. And I'm glad that you put it on the table, because somebody needs to. What is the political ramification of the worldview that we think is correct and which we wish to defend? And one of the reasons that I would put that question on the table of, well, what I'm ready to give up is, it would be great for me if somebody could convince me that the manifest image is reconcilable, because it will make naturalism far more marketable. But let me get back to the second thing, which is more substantial. Blind variation natural selection is, of course, the source of all adaptations in the biological realm. But my view is it's also the source of all adaptations in the human and cultural realm, including all of the wonderful inventions and artifacts that we have produced. Blind variation and natural selection is the only process operating in the ontogeny and the development of the brain that produces behavior which is adaptive, whether it means, scratching an itch or making a cup or a pen or an Apple computer. There's no design anywhere. It's all blind variation, natural
Well, all
selection.
right. Or
There's
that's design, it's just not a top-down designer. You see, what I think you're doing, and in a way, Richard too, is you're taking the folk ideology of design more seriously than you should. Look, the term atom means indivisible in Greek. So we should say, oh, there aren't any atoms, there aren't any atoms. No, well, instead, we said, turns out you can divide an atom. It was, and people buy that. You know, they learn to get, initially, they thought atoms were indivisible. Now we discover, oh my goodness, they're divisible in all sorts of ways. I think it's an easier pedagogical task to convince people that there's design without a designer, design without an intelligent designer, than it is to convince them that there isn't any design.
So our objective should be to change everybody's conceptual economy while leaving the tokens that they use in everyday speech alone, changing the meanings of all the words.
Because my design stance works exactly as well on biology as it works on any artifact. And biology is, in my terms, reverse engineering. If it's reverse engineering the biosphere. If it's reverse engineering, then the biologists are helping themselves to design concepts left, right, and center, and we should just say, look, there's a perfectly naturalistic, non-intelligent design sense of design that is everywhere evident in biology. And biologists, what Darwin did, this is your half full, half empty. What Darwin did is showed how to naturalize the concept of design. And biologically generated design is not second-rate design.
It's the only kind.
It's the only kind of design, because I agree about that too. It is, but all the things that people marvel at when it comes to thinking about design things, the economy, the very things that Paley talks about.
So what is politically incorrect about, I'll yield for a short question. What's politically incorrect about using the word adaptation instead of design? I mean, it seems to me that using the word design enables theism.
I know this is
so we should just replace it.
This is the but I think this is notice it's not a substantive debate. We all agree about the marvels of the biosphere, and we agree that there's a naturalistic explanation of it. The question is, should we be afraid that if we use the word design, we're giving a hostage to the creationists and the intelligent designers, or not? That's really the
As a layman, I hope that you scientists aren't so concerned about political correctness and are more concerned simply about clarity. Because I hope we can figure out, even as laymen, if you're clear, how not to misconstrue what you're saying. I would urge that. Otherwise, I think you might actually muddy what you're saying, and that would be a shame.
I want to go back to, Richard, to Alex's response, or lack thereof, I think, to Don, which is this. So at one point you said that nobody disagrees that everything is made of fermions. Yeah, that's true. Nobody disagrees, but that's not the discussion, is it? The discussion is, does knowledge of the fundamental laws of physics, however you want to think about the laws of physics, which is a whole different discussion, are they just empirically adequate generalizations, or laws in some more strong sense of the term, or whatever it is, are those the necessary and sufficient conditions to derive in principle everything else that the special sciences do? That is the question, and it seems to me that it's much more complicated than simply all agreeing that everything is made of fermions. We do agree about that one. So there we get into discussions of how do we conceptualize laws or explanations or both. It does come down to what Don called or referred to something like a promissory note on the part of reductionism. That is, there's this idea that, well, in principle things are reducible to fundamental physics. Well, what is that principle exactly? I've never heard it spelled out particularly convincingly. And furthermore, the empirical evidence seems to me to be prima facie the opposite. That is, if you look at the world, at the way science looks at the world, there's plenty of evidence, first-hand evidence, and scientific evidence of emergent properties. Now, whether that doesn't justify the further metaphysical conclusion that there are emergent properties in a strong sense, I agree. But it seems to me that it at least goes contrary to the opposite metaphysical conclusion that, oh, we don't need emergent properties because clearly there's no such a thing around. There is. So there is a serious issue there that science has not handled very well. In fact, I believe it was a physicist back in the 70s, Paul Anderson, I think it was Paul.
Phil.
Phil, thank you.
Philip, yeah.
Who said that yes, fundamental physics is very interesting and is very important, but in fact it hasn't. The more fundamental physicists go that way, the less they have to say to the rest of science, including to the rest of physics. It becomes more and more irrelevant, not because it is intrinsically relevant, but because precisely we don't have this way of cashing out the idea that we can go and reduce everything down to the ultimate law of everything.
I totally disagree with the thrust of your remarks, but I really hoped we would talk about that this afternoon.
Yeah, this is exactly what I think we should be talking about this afternoon.
I'm perfectly happy to brag.
But you said something that I want to pick up on because it's relevant to what Sean said earlier about if we're asking whether only things made of elementary particles are real, and you say, well, things like laws and poems are real because they're in the brains. Sean asked the question, what about the Schrödinger equation? Someone said, well, mathematics is a difficult thing, but one could argue, I suppose, that mathematics is also a creation of human brains. But the Schrödinger equation is not a statement of
It's not just mathematics, right?
It's a statement of physics. I think it's probably not the final truth. I mean, I think there's a deeper truth underlying modern quantum mechanics. And whatever the fundamental laws of physics are, and I insist on using the word fundamental, although I'm sure you wouldn't like that. Whatever the fundamental laws of physics are, they're surely not in our brains because we don't know what they are yet.
They were here before us.
But I think they're real. I mean, I think they are why things are the way they are. And they're real in a way that doesn't fit your definition. And if I didn't think they were real, I probably would have thought I made a mistake in my career because this is what I've been aiming at.
So why don't they fit my
life.
definition, though? I certainly offered a definition that was intended to encompass the reality of the fundamental laws of physics.
Well, I don't understand how your I'm not sure I remember exactly what your definition was, but the idea that it is something that's part of, it is made of ordinary particles. It doesn't fit the laws of physics. They're not made of anything.
No, well, it's ordinary particles and the relations among them, which are described in the laws of physics.
Okay, well, if you say and the relations among them, well, it's the relations that are real.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Okay, I can't. Then you've gotten out of it. Okay.
That's a relation.
Except. I mean, I also don't want to. We shouldn't. If we agree that we don't want to talk about emergence yet, it's hard to quite draw this line. But Alex, you responded in trying to flesh out the physics fixes all the facts. You tried to flesh it out in a way that's very common, right? A kind of swamp managed way, right? You ask us to imagine another part of the universe that's, as they like to say, atom for atom identical, right? All the relations the same. Now, we think we can imagine that because we can say it, but actually not really, right? I mean, so the physics of any chunk of the universe is partly a function of the rest of the universe. So now what you're really asking us to do is imagine another universe, right? That is molecule for molecule identical to this one, right? Yeah, what you're actually smuggling in, because what you mean, since you can't put the full physical flesh on those bones, what you're really asking us to say is, imagine a universe that would have exactly the same description in the ideal physics that no one's yet come up with, right, as the description we would give of this universe in the ideal physics that nobody yet has, right? And And so you've smuggled in pretty much the entire thesis you want us to buy, right? In trying to get us to, I mean, this is what I meant by a little dose of verification is a very useful thing, right? If you want us to do a thought experiment, we really need to be able to flesh out what is being described in that thought experiment. It's not enough to just have a very, very general, high-level extensional description of it.
I think the analysis thought experiment is actually perfectly good, even as he said it, but Richard was.
Yes, I want to know what
patient.
Richard raised his hand when Massimo had raised the matter
conversation got
of
diverted. I wanted to reply to Dan on design. Dan's point is all based upon the idea that natural design is just as good as human design, and maybe it is, but that's not the only consideration. There's also the provenance of the two designs. Alex was suggesting that actually fundamentally even human design is a kind of natural selection. But natural design has no foresight. Human design can look ahead and say, if we go on polluting the atmosphere or get global warming, in a century's time, there's going to be a disaster not just for me personally, but for the whole of humanity, for the whole of the ecosystem. That's looking ahead of time. And nature doesn't do that. Nature optimizes in the short term for the individual actor that's doing it. Now that's a very, very important difference. If you assumed that if you used the same word design for biological design and for human design, then you would get the wrong answer when faced with conundrums about natural design, which people do every day in biology. There are people who think that because adaptation is a good thing, therefore whatever is going to be a good thing in the human sense will evolve, and it won't. Species may drive themselves extinct by going hell for leather like the Gadarene swine over the cliff of short-term adaptation. And so I think that it doesn't have to be the word designoid, but something that expresses both the fact that biological design is very, very good, though by the way not perfect, is very, very good, and expresses the fact that it doesn't come about by the same process, and in particular, you'll get the wrong answer if you're a biologist who assumes something like, well, actually it's teleology, but yeah.
No, that's very good, Richard, and I of course completely agree that that's the fundamental difference between the products of natural selection and the products, some of the products of human design. And the way I argue about this is to say there are reasons why the things in the biological world are designed the way they are, but they're not represented by nature in any way. They're not represented by the process, but they're in effect uncovered by the process. Whereas we are the first reason representers. We human beings, we're the first reason representers on the planet. And that makes a huge difference. I got a paper on this called The Evolution of Reason, which I'll send around. We have this model of design my example is Gaudi. He designed the Sagrada Familia. And it looks very much like a termite castle. This slide with the two right next to each other. It's just stunning how similar these two structures are. They say profoundly different processes created these two structures. The termite structure, it's all bottom up. There's no foresight. There's no representation of reasons. With Gaudi, he's got the blueprints, the manifestos. He's got the reason all out there in advance. That's a huge difference. Still, we also want to talk about the similarities. So I think now it's coming down to which words should we use. And I think we should use the word design for the reasons I said, just to reiterate. Reverse engineering works in biology. And it works because biologists can ask the question, what is this for? And there's not always an answer. Sometimes it's just inert historical fact that that's the way it is. But very often, there is something it's for. And I think that right there naturalizes a notion of purpose, a notion of function, a notion of design, and that we should recognize that what Darwin has done is secured for us naturalists an honest way of using function talk, purpose talk, design talk, and we just have to be very careful always to remind ourselves, as you say, that nature has no look ahead.
You're
The fundamental-
political damage done by using the term adaptation or design away that is obviated by using your term design. So I want to know exactly how we're turning people away from evolution if we avoid the use of the word design. I mean,
Well,
you really
but we're
could-
still going to use the word function and what is it for.
Yeah, I
So
think
we
that-
might as well.
I think that, it's a dirty little secret that among us naturalist philosophers, that our biggest problem looks like an inconsequential problem outside of philosophy, and that's giving a naturalistic account of reason.
Could I just, I'm sorry. Sean, did you want to?
No, I was just mumbling, go ahead.
So I just was trying to get us, I just still want to go back, and this is trying to be helpful so I'm clear on what we're talking about. Sometimes Alex talks about we naturalists, I don't know what that team is yet. And
You're on.
no, but I'm not on your one exactly. Well, I'll use Alex, because Alex and I have been talking about this forever, but, and when he says things like, I hope my mind will be changed, I'm just, I doubt it.
You mean you doubt, I hope it will be
hopes
changed?
it.
Both. So I just want to go back to what Stephen's request for focusing on basic ontology. And so it seems to me that Dennett mentioned the Eddington's famous two tables case, which I think Sellers also discusses, right? So this is where Eddington says, I walk into my library, this philosopher's library, and I see two desks. One is the desk of ordinary common sense, and the other is the desk recently revealed by what I now know to be elementary particle physics. And then I take it, I don't remember exactly how he puts this, the question is something like this. Can he keep, first of all, this is a kind of psychological question, keep both perspectives on the table in his head at once? Another is, could both be true at once? Another is, if they're not, are they compatible or incompatible? And this is a kind of, I think, question about, that is being asked here. And so if we start with a kind of Alex kind of view about what there is and all there is, basic ontology, and say there's just fermions and bosons and their relations, and that physics fixes all the facts, then that does lead Alex in many moments to say things like, well, things that we call people and tables and chairs are, as you put it a few minutes ago, they're overlays. And that, I take it, is a kind of a way of...
Words are overlays. People and tables and chairs are not overlays.
Well, this is what I'm curious about on your view. In other words, the questions become, if we start to think about the... I'm just inclined to go with Stephen's way of putting things, that there's a lot of things that are real as real can be. Libraries are real as real can be because two people in this room are here because of having gone to libraries, and symphonies are real, and poems are real, and certainly tables and chairs and people are real, and plans people have for their future are real, and consciousness is real. And so these are nothing that a sensible naturalist, for both political and sort of other reasons, ought to deny. It has nothing to do with political correctness. It just has to do with, this is the basic furniture of the universe that we start with. And I just don't see that there's any reason, given what we know so far, and there are norms and there are values and there are virtues and there are all these things, that there's any reason to go eliminativist about the upper levels of reality. I think it's both a political, a PR would be a PR disaster in addition to other PR disasters that we talk about, eliminating all talk of, well, I would go back, I don't want to go back to the evolutionary issue. So I guess I just think that a sensible naturalism would start with the things that are part of what we can all agree are the basic furniture of the universe, Some of them will include abstract things like constitutions and Schrodinger equations and things like that. I mean, it doesn't seem that naturalism has to fuss over those things as much as, I agree with what some people say here. Some people get more exercised about what they're going to do about mathematical entities and objects. But I think the issues there often come from the fact that some people think that, whereas we're confident that there are tables and chairs, we're not as confident that there are numbers and things like that. And that's sort of a, so that's, that once, if one were to decide that numbers and irrational numbers and square roots and innumerable infinites are part of the basic fabric of the universe, then it seems that you'll have trouble with certain kinds of naturalism, in particular your kind of naturalism, because clearly such things don't look as if they're made up of fermions and bosons. But I would hold off that as a, to me personally, I mean, that is an interesting area of worry for naturalists. But I think moving reductively or eliminativist is just unnecessary and seems to me to be violation of common sense. Some of the issues, the other just set of issues, and again, I'm trying to hold off on emergentism, it does seem to me that among the basic kinds of things that there are, some of the things that there are inanimate. And maybe what happened not only the first 30 seconds or 5 minutes after the Big Bang, but for 10 billion years was that there was only inanimate stuff. And then somehow out of inanimate stuff, there was then other real stuff. I'm avoiding emergence. There was living stuff. And then later on, sometime there was sentient living stuff. And those again are things that we should think that, you know, as the second law of thermodynamics does its thing, or as time progresses, we get new things in the world. And those are real. Again, real as real can be. So that's a kind of a recommendation that a plausible way would be to start with the sort of ordinary furniture of the universe. And then, going back to Eddington's type of question, I get how it's hard for Eddington to think about his table under both descriptions at the same time, but normally we're not asked to do that, and I'm not sure that the two ways of thinking about the table are inconsistent, so that there's a problem between the scientific and the ordinary image in that case. Now, sometimes there are, I take it. Sometimes there are such conflicts, but I don't think that's one of them, for example.
Yeah, I mean, my attitude would be that thinking about the table as a physical folk manifest image table and as made of atoms and molecules at the same time is exactly what you're not supposed to do. And, you know, so you shouldn't be surprised that it's hard to do it. And I'm not sure if we have yet on the table a proposed criterion, a demarcation criterion for what is real and what is not real. But mine would be that something is real if it forms an important part of a useful way of talking about the actual world. So the present king of France is
So reality is contingent on utility.
Well, our description of reality is contingent on utility at the very least. So I certainly could imagine talking about reality in a way that never referred to the concept of the Constitution of the United States and would not be mistaken in any way. I could just list all the fermions and bosons and have them evolve according to Schrodinger equation. I would not be wrong, but I would be missing something really interesting, and I can't come up with a better word than useful about talking about the world. I could talk about the atoms. Hey, this is Janna Levin, everybody. We'll let her introduce herself later. I could talk about the atoms in the molecules in this atmosphere in our room right now, atom by atom, kinetic theory. I would be missing the opportunity to describe some very useful regularities about the behavior of the atmosphere of this room in terms of pressure and density and the laws of thermodynamics. And also, I have no right to think that the description in terms of atoms or fermions and bosons is the bottom one, right? I mean, there could be, and I don't want the reality of the atoms to depend on what year I'm talking about it. So I think that all the different levels in which we can talk about things, and we'll beat this to death this afternoon, have a claim to reality that is essentially equally strong.
But religious people will say that the notion of God is an important part of talking about.
Well, good.
And Stephen said God is real, in effect, right? Because everything is real, right?
Well, only in the sense that Santa Claus is real.
But now,
we haven't even defined naturalism yet in this conference.
But let me give you a way to think about it. I mean, the question
it seems to me that will come up from this is, let's imagine that this YouTube goes viral and all the fundamentalists in this country listen to it and buy your story completely and burn down their churches. Okay, now
It would do no permanent good.
all right, well, that's fine. But my point is the meaning of what you just said. The meaning of all of this stuff. Well, it's not the sounds that were produced, it's the meaning of it. It caused physical things to change in the world. Radical, major restructuring of the matter on the face of the earth. Now, in that sense, I would say that the meaning is real. The meaning has causal efficacy, physical causal efficacy. But the meaning is going to be something that's not the sounds, it's not the movement of neurons, it's something else. And we haven't got a good way of talking about it yet, in fact. And the story I want to say is that I think, just like we can't say that physics has bottomed out, certainly as an evolutionary biologist, I would say that our understanding of evolution is not bottomed out. There's a lot of processes there that we don't fully understand yet, and the more we've pursued it, the more we realize that Darwin's story is, in effect, it's agnostic about mechanism. And there's huge amounts of mechanistic stuff we've discovered that are making it a more complex story. If that's your story about the brain, isn't it possible that vast amount of new information is going to come out about how the brain does its job using complexity and various ways of talking about this process that don't look quite as simple as we've just talked about? My suspicion is that we will eventually call this teleology. It's not the kind of Cartesian teleology or the kind of God teleology, but it's the real teleology that got me here. That is, I wanted to come here and chat with you guys and listen to it. That's real teleology, as far as I'm concerned. It's the same kind of teleology that's driving this story that I just told about, fundamentalism. It's real. It makes a difference in the world. We just haven't come up with a good way to explain it. And I'm not convinced that we're ever going to do it by just saying it's quarks and gluons.
So you put the word meaning on the table, and Dan put the word foresight on the table. And the problem for us naturalists, it's related to that other moose in the middle of the living room reason. The problem for us naturalists is to give a naturalistic account of meaning and foresight.
Yeah.
Okay? And the difference between you and me is my bet is that we're not going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
That we're going to discover that meaning and foresight are just more overlay. Very useful, okay? Perhaps indispensable given our culture and way of life. But without the kind of relationship to the rest of science that would vindicate their reality.
By reality, I'm trying to get at what kind of reality that is.
I want to get it exactly right. You said that.
And this is, of course, what the rest of this weekend is about,
No,
foresight
I
and meaning.
I just wanted to get what you just said straight. So you're saying that meaning, that we're not going to be able to come up with a scientific account of meaning because you didn't say why, I guess, but
It's
because
I've already talked enough, but I could gesture at, say, the work of Coyne,
okay,
or the work of Dennett on homunculi. Or Searle, using it as a modus tollens. There's lots of arguments on the table about the difficulties associated with giving a naturalistic account of meaning. And it's one of the strongest bases on which the anti-naturalist mounts his and her opposition to naturalism.
right. But of course, we could acknowledge that without giving up naturalism, right? I mean, naturalism, after all.
Of course, naturalism is a program,
Exactly.
and this is one of the most important problems on the research program of naturalism.
Right, but beyond that, I mean, that is, I would agree. But beyond that, I think we could, even if it turned out that a scientific account, I'm not saying that it will, but if it turned out that a scientific account of meaning is impossible to human beings, it's inaccessible, it's epistemically inaccessible, we're just not going to get there. So what, right? That doesn't actually give any particularly good foundation to any rejection of naturalism, just because it becomes an argument from ignorance. It just says, oh, well, you guys can't
That's
do it,
like an
therefore.
argument that because we can't investigate the entire universe, we can't exclude the possibility that Santa Claus exists.
Strictly speaking, that's true. Okay, fine, if that's your
But you have
standard of
to
proof,
think-
it's
but-
not part of science or naturalism.
Okay.
But we define naturalism at all? I mean, this whole meeting is about moving it forward, and it seems like people are
Yeah.
desperate definitions of what it is. I don't know what it is.
My working definition is that naturalism is the idea that the natural world is all that exists. The world is not divided into separate realms that would in any useful way be called natural and supernatural. Anyone else have a?
I wanted to follow something. There was I thought a disagreement between Steve and Alex that wasn't resolved, which is we asked whether the Schrödinger equation was real.
Right.
And you said, okay, well, fermions and bosons exist and also the relations between them. But the Schrödinger equation is not just a list of all the relations that have obtained between fermions and bosons over the history of time. There's something else, and my guess is that Stephen Weinberg believes that there's something over and above just the list of all the facts that have obtained.
Sure.
So there is a disagreement, there's a substantial
No,
disagreement
but
between these two
I
positions.
thought the relations was sufficiently broad that it would include my conception of laws of nature.
What is the
I
overall?
didn't think
talking
we were
about the future
disagreeing.
or something even more than that?
So is this a problem about the ontological status, as we might say, of propositions?
Ontological, if by ontological status,
Well,
you mean what is real? So
Well,
what
yeah,
you said
ontological
is
status
that-
is,
okay,
are they
so-
real or not? And then statements as opposed to the inscriptions that we use to express them and communicate them.
I don't mean do books about the Schrödinger equation exist.
Right.
I believe they exist. But I think that Stephen Weinberg would say that over and above simply the history of all the facts that have obtained about the relations
Yeah,
between
there's
bosons
the
and
proposition expressed.
Exactly. There's this
Yeah.
underlying regularity that is not simply a perceptual fact or just something we've noticed, but
This-
actually has an independent existence.
This is
You
the
would
same
deny that.
as the problem about
I
the
didn't
status.
think he was denying that.
No, of course I was absolutely not. And I was saying that for me as a naturalist, the biggest problem is accommodating the ontological status of such propositions. Okay? And the clearest and simplest and least controversial examples of such propositions and their indispensability is mathematics. Okay? And I certainly don't want to say that Schrödinger's wave equation is mathematics, because it ain't mathematics. It employs mathematical expressions and functions to make a claim about the nature of physical reality. Okay? But it shares with mathematical propositions the problematical status for us, that of course it's not made of stuff, it's different from the books that inscribe it, and we need an account as naturalists of what kind of a thing it is, if it exists at all, and we need an account that will not open up, as Jerry's so concerned with expressing, the floodgates for all kinds of other mystery mongering. That's why the problems about the nature of mathematical truth are so problematical for us naturalists. Right, Rebecca?
Yeah, but also I think, as you had brought up, the problem of meaning in general, and I think in your book, you are eliminative about
meaning.
Meaning about aboutness
Yes.
in general. That how can anything material represent, be about, point to, indicate, and there I'm worried if naturalism commits us to eliminating aboutness, I'm worried about the internal coherence of naturalism. I mean, at the very least, we want to be able to say that scientific theories are about the world, right? We need that as naturalists. And I don't know on your very mad dog view of naturalism if you can even say that
and all I can say by way of apologies, if you haven't read the book, it was written for a trade audience, and I wasn't going to be able to give an account of the response to that beyond one paragraph, a paragraph at the end of the 6th chapter, but naturally I've written a lot about that, and it's only for the delectation of philosophers, because even stating the problem is very difficult.
And in his most recent work, he has still not answered that question again.
Owen has heard and read some of these papers.
Alex, and maybe I'm just catching up to all the points you made in the past, but if there are laws about, I suppose, laws about reason, those laws could exist just as much as laws about.
Sure.
And
I
so,
accept that hypothetical claim.
And So there can be laws about things that exist and have sort of foundational ontological status for you, but they're about things that don't have foundational ontological status.
If there are such laws.
If there are. That's also.
But of course,
inherent.
no, actually, if there are such laws and they do have foundational status, then there are the things that are mentioned in those laws.
So how do you know that a law has a foundational status as opposed to being a theory about overlays?
That's an epistemic problem. I'm not omniscient. I have certain hypotheses and certain guidelines. Okay, in particular, consilience is my major guideline, consilience with physics, when it comes to things that are relatively controversial and about which it is impossible to get good, reliable, controlled experimental verification.
Can I ask you something, Alex? Is it for you? Is there real explanatory autonomy then for higher levels? What is explanation actually?
Oh well, that's a really good question, and presumably we'll get into it this afternoon. I take it explanation is a procedure for reducing cognitive itches, curiosity. Okay, explanation, unless it's entirely. We could treat explanation as a class of exchanges, inquiries, and answers to inquiries that satisfy inquiry, where explanation turns out to be, whether something is an explanation or not, turns out to be contingent on the human cognitive interests and limitations. Or we can treat explanation as the full and complete causal account of the explanandum phenomenon, in which case it might not be cognitively accessible to us.
Alex, you've been called a number of things, mad dog, Cartesian, and so I'm very reluctant to use a term, but I'm going to anyway. What just struck me is you're a very old-fashioned kind of philosopher in a certain way. You are a sort of essentialist. You take the notion of reality and you think, by God, there's the pure, triple distilled essence of reality, and if it ain't that, it ain't real. And explanation you just gave me, either there's this sort of wishy-washy, relativistic sort of thing, or there's real explanation that has the essence of explanation, and turns out you can't explain anything and almost nothing's real. Now, that's a very familiar philosophical stance which goes back to Socrates, and you're happily aware of this. And by my lights, what you're doing is you're falling in with a philosophical bad habit, which is ultimately due to Socrates.
And look what happened to him.
Yeah.
That was not a threat, right?
You're saying, define your terms. I want the essence. I want the essence of this. I want the essence of that. And then you settle on what the essence is. And then you show that, given that, turns out the world is very different from what we thought it was.
From the manifest image.
From the manifest image. But there's another view of philosophy, which, and this lets me say something about, I use the word political. I'm now regretting having said that because people assumed that I meant political correctness. No, I meant something. No, I meant something more like explanatory efficacy. You know, I mean the strategic task of making the world clear to others.
That's really
now, and the sense is, if it's a strategic task of making the world clear to each other, then it's got its sort of relativism built right into it. It's not as if Socrates lays down what the right way of doing it is. Let's find out. Let's try things out. Let's see what works. And it's a notion of explanation that Sean, I think, was expressing, and also, I think, in a way that Steve. And we're left with a sort of comical situation where the scientists are actually comfortable with a a little bit loosey-goosey, rough and ready sense of explanation. They know what they mean by real. They know what they mean by explanation. And you're not letting them have that. You who want to honor science are holding science to a higher and more unrealistic standard of definition than the scientists are themselves using.
Of course, the moment we recognize that there is this relativistic task we face, this negotiation around which set of propositions we think are best for capturing all the conciliant complexity of reality. As soon as we recognize that, we then also must recognize that we then have the very, very difficult problem of figuring out how to rule out all the other bad ways of trying to shoehorn reality into a picture, which is what, as naturalists, we want to deny, right? So we still have to, Alex makes the job of distinguishing between what good scientists and naturalists should say and what other people say too easy, right?
Just like
it's
logical
really very hard.
positivism.
Yeah.
So Alex, the old-fashioned mad dog Cartesian, has also been very patient as we picked on him, so we'll give him the last word before lunch.
No, I actually,
be very short.
I waive the last word because, as I said,
It's hungry.
no, actually I want to go running, I'm not hungry.
So you have
I
reasons.
think that the last word is, I think this conversation has put on the table what I take to be the really serious issues, at least as the philosophers see them. And if the non-philosophers don't, then we probably have a little work to do, and maybe this afternoon will be the opportunity for doing that work, for getting people to see that there really are issues here. The differences are not matters of mere definition or taste, okay? They are alternative views about the nature of reality.
Excellent. With that, we adjourn. Over the course of lunch or running or whatever it is, think about if you want to just have dinner downstairs in one group table at, say, 7:30, 7 o'clock, whatever the time would be, and we'll take a head count, we'll get a reservation, and anyone else is free to wander around the city if they want to.
Oh, I was right.
Janna will introduce herself after lunch, because we're hungry.
Yes, it seems like we are. No, I think we go downstairs.